So hi, good morning. Welcome to a panel discussion on how to talk about games. I'm Phelps. I'm the president of the Higher Education Video Game Alliance, which I will talk about later. With me is Lindsay, who is the vice president of the Higher Education Video Game Alliance, teaches at some universities he will tell you about. And apparently we're going to give him some sort of award tonight. I don't know. So we'll give him lots of grief throughout the panel on this fact. And Mia Consalvo, who's at Concordia and is also the Games Chair of Canada or something like that.
Yes. All of Canada.
All of Canada. She is it. So the way we've organized this is we're going to kind of each come up and give a short presentation, and then there'll be lots of time for Q&A after the fact. So with that, I think you're first.
Great. Let's get started. Okay, so I talk very quickly, and it should take 7 to 8 minutes to get through my deck on how to talk about games, specifically around moral panic and misunderstanding. So I'm Lindsay Grace. I've had to have this conversation in a variety of contexts. I've actually worked at these three institutions, largely as the sort of founder, co-director of the Game Center at Miami University. And just to confuse you, I'm currently at the University of Miami. That's the one that's in Florida, not the one in Ohio. And I was also the founder of the AU Game Lab. So part of what we're sharing today are a lot of our observations about how to talk about games in specific contexts. So I'm going to give you the moral panic gist. So I am, as mentioned, the vice president of the Higher Education Video Games Alliance. And I have a book that talks a lot about this coming out next month. You can pre-order it now. My publisher is happy that I have this slide up. Cool? All right, let's go. So let's talk about moral panic. In short, the idea here is that we're just going to sort of do a quick run through. So I'm sure it's no surprise to anyone here that society has a long history of moral panic, including the witch hunts of the 16th century. To the comic book burnings of the 1950s. And one of the things to remember is that there's sort of panic around games in the 21st century. So if you're unfamiliar with this event, essentially they were buying back video games and it was similar to a burning, but not actually a burning. So at some point, I believe all new leisure seems to be subject to moral panic. I'm going to run through a couple of examples, give you a little historical context. So we'll talk about comic books, we'll talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and we'll talk about television. You can see how long each of these lasted and why. So here's your historical context. We'll start with comic books. In the last century, comic books were considered the source of much debate. Between 1938 and 1950, comic books' golden age sort of ran. And I think the best way to remember it, and I love this little slide, is because at one point, comic books were basically responsible for $72 million in annual revenue. And that slide looks a lot like the game slides that I often use when we talk about, say, the ESA's current estimate of how valuable the games community is. So in 1948, we had a moral panic in the US around games. This particular person was a lot of the driving force behind it. He was quoted as saying that he thinks Hitler was a beginner compared to comic books. And folks like Frederick Wertham, essentially in his book Seduction of the Innocent, really lambasted comic books as a source of juvenile delinquency. If you want to understand why the world has gone bad, it is clearly the comic books that have done it. The result was that people started to burn comic books in the same tradition that we've seen in other censorship and related contexts. One of the things to note in this history is that in 1954, a self-regulated board essentially created something called the Comics Code. Some highlights from the Comics Code include the fact that criminals should always be banned. This was a mandate of the Comic Code. You could not get the stamp if you didn't do these things. Authority figures were never to be questioned. They were always to be respected. And you had to respect important things like the sanctity of marriage, which basically meant that there would never be divorce depicted in these games, in these comics, nor homosexual or other relationships. What you'll also notice is that comics stopped telling different stories. During the golden age of comics, there was a wide variety, similar to the context you might say about games right now, and they started telling the same stories. So we'll skip over to Dungeons and Dragons, which we all know is the reason that the world has also gone horribly, horribly wrong, right? Pat Pulling is the Frederick Wortham of the D&D sphere. Essentially, Pat Pulling created something called BAD. Sounds a lot like MAD, if you know about Mothers Against Drunk Driving. This was Bothered About Drunk Driving in 1983. I'm sorry, Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. We're all bothered about drunk driving. But it was about Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons. And she'd actually also written a bit later a book called The Devil's Web. You can tell by both that beautiful cover and some of the context under which she discusses. She was very, very concerned about what Dungeons and Dragons was doing to the youth. People were quoted as saying these sorts of things. There's a lot of rhetoric around Dungeons and Dragons. Basically, it was accused of inspiring suicides, occult activity. It was being aligned with rape, prostitution, sadism, and a variety of others. Part of the challenge was that one person who had actually killed someone, his name is Darren Molitor, had blamed Dungeons and Dragons for inspiring him to do this work, to do this horrible thing. But ultimately, there's literally no science that has proven any link, I know you're very surprised to hear this, between Dungeons and Dragons and any kind of bad behavior. In fact, people barely researched it. Next, television. And you know where I'm going with television. In short, in the 40 years of academic research around addiction and aggression in games, we still don't know what TV does to people. So you will know, for example, that there are publications, well-respected publications, that clearly say that television inspires aggression. At the same time, you will find plenty that clearly say TV clearly does not inspire aggression. Despite that, you'll also see that there's plenty of AntiTV reading available. So this is just a screenshot of a bunch of good reads that clearly tell you that you should stop watching television right now. And one of my favorite publications in this context is a publication that basically claimed that most of the criteria for television addiction or substance abuse was the same. So if you looked at people who were substance abuse dependent, you'd find the same thing in television addiction. And that particular publication came from our much appreciated Csikszentmihalyi positive psychologist, around which many people start designing some of their own game psychology mind. So, in the US, we continue to live in a relatively free speech society that allows for a variety of TV viewing options. We have not created a very explicit code to prevent people from getting addicted to television. So let's get to games. One way that I think the whole gist of this quick talk is to help you understand that one way to talk about games in this current context today is to remind people of our worldwide political past with leisure. To remind them of the history we've had in trying to affect people and basically reminding them of things like Dungeons and Dragons and the Comic Code. And remind them that there were people who misled us about the detriment of these works, and that what we want to do is actually highlight the dangerous game of pitting leisure against morality. It is leisure, it is not morality. So leisure is often political, and I like to remind people of this. So I actually think that attacking leisure is an opportunity to chip at specific cultures and enforce your own culture. Right? It's a little bit of a maneuver around culture wars. And often to the actual detriment of the medium, if not the consumers of the medium as well. So attacking games actually mirrors the past, attacks on other types of leisure, which I think in an era of declining leisure, where in the US workism is becoming the new religion, and work may actually be killing us, maybe we shouldn't attack leisure, we should instead ask questions about the root of our discord, what's really going on. But either way, like TV, it's going to take a long time to determine aggression and addiction links to any of the mediums that we consume. Remember that games don't actually have to be burned to be erased. It is so much easier to remove us, historically. And if you want more, I've written a few articles. You can kind of take a snapshot of these. And then also on the addiction front, we did a panel literally in this room last year for Games for Change that you can see the video on. And then I and the other panelists here did a talk at GDC that was much more comprehensive than this. and you can actually get some of the highlights and links to some of the material right there at that website, including reading a lot of the for and against literature. But just remember that moral panics, you could literally argue that the current moral panic around video games is still present, so from 1970 to now. Thanks for listening. I'm Lindsay Grace. I could also awkwardly just fast forward to you guys.
Okay, my name is Mia Consalvo. I'm the Canada Research Chair in Game Studies and Design at Concordia University. And I drew the short straw of getting to talk about games of violence. And this is something I've been thinking about for a while because, you know, if you study games, if you make games, you probably get asked at some point, you know, like, but don't, you know, isn't it bad for kids to play too many games? Or like, what is Grand Theft Auto doing to children now? And so I basically did a lot of the work of reviewing the literature so that you don't have to, and I will share that with you today. But first, I want to remind all of us, social science in general has been going through a big problem. You may have seen some of these reports that there was a replication crisis where social scientists, psychologists were going back and like trying to replicate older studies to, you know, make sure that the findings held up. And what do you know, they didn't. The marshmallow test is like one of the most famous of these, where you put kids in a room with marshmallows. You know, you tell them like if you can wait like 10 minutes, you'll get more or something. And like the conclusion was, you know, if the kid can hold out, you know, they're going to be a super achiever in life. Right, and you know, like the kid that could not wait, they're just like a horrible sloth, and we should just, you know, I'm sorry. What they found out was that actually it's more tied to things like your class position, your social background, you know, how much money you make, like whether you're food deprived. You know, these are kind of important issues. So the larger point mostly is to take like lots of social science research with a grain of sand, a grain of salt, because we don't necessarily know, you know, how much these findings are going to hold up. And if you really want a comprehensive review of the research on the topic of games and violence, which I am drawing from mostly today, I would suggest you read this book. It is like, I think 276 pages or something. I talked to my panelists quite a bit about how I read all of these pages, and they did not. This is just one example of something in there. We're basically saying, you know, for one thing, trying to pull apart the effect of one aspect of our life, one activity that we engage in, and say that this is the cause of behavior. We're humans. It is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to do that, right, with games. And the researchers also saying, trying to separate out violent video games from all the other violent media, right? How can we do that? We can't raise humans in bubbles and see how they turn out if we're just going to say, you get comic books, and you get video games, and you get kale.
Kale.
And I'm just going to skip by this, but again, games and violence, the research is arising from some of the work like that Lindsay mentioned, you know, the moral panics, but people have studied movies and violence, television, and games were just the new kid on the block. The early work, and actually this is still ongoing now, I would say, on games, like trying to determine whether they cause aggression and violence, mostly falls into three methodologies: surveys, naturalistic observation, and experiments. Okay, and there are problems with each of these. Now, no method is perfect. But it's helpful to think about what are the limitations of each. So with surveys, for one thing, you know, this is where you're asking kids or maybe asking parents about kids' behavior, and most of this research is about kids. But, you know, like, do you see changes, or, you know, like, have you noticed things? And with a survey, there's no pre and post, like there's no causality. The most that you might be able to infer is that there is a link in some way, but you don't know necessarily which came first. Another method that people have used is naturalistic observation, where, for example, the researcher goes and like stares at kids in a playground, to see what they're doing. That's not creepy at all. The problem here is, well, first of all, you can see what people are actually doing, but you have no control over the setting. And it's probably going to be difficult to get access to certain sites. You don't know necessarily, you can't, you have to make inferences about why people are doing what they're doing. And so it's kind of limited in terms of like what you can conclude from them. And then finally, experiments. This is where you have Group A and Group B. Group A plays Grand Theft Auto, and then you have them like engage in a task. Group B plays My Little Pony, the video game, and engages in a task. And you see what the differences are, because in that sense, you could potentially establish causality, right? The problem is, first, it's an artificial setting. It's a lab. People don't necessarily act the same way in labs that they do in their homes or in other places. And also effect time. So you're looking usually, you're applying the test, the post-test, usually 10 to 15 minutes later. They probably also only engaged in the activity for that amount of time, maybe slightly longer. But most of the research shows that even if there is an effect shortly after, playing a game, if you do have the resources to test, to do a post-survey like a month or 2 months or a year later, most of those effects disappear. So those are some of the problems with like the methodologies themselves. There are, however, other challenges when you're thinking about aggression or violence. First of all, it would be incredibly unethical to actually, test if people are actually violent or not. Are they hitting and kicking each other? And so, ethics review boards will never let you do this. And so you have to use a stand-in for violence. So researchers have separated out violent thoughts, violent feelings, and violent behaviors. And these are not all the same thing, okay? Thought is just you thought about doing something. Like you're driving down the street, somebody cuts you off, you're like, I'd really like to ram their car. That's a violent thought. Doesn't mean you actually did anything about it. Violent feelings, that's that feeling of getting angry, and then the behavior. People study some of these, mixtures of these. It can be difficult to separate out. Researchers also have used very different definitions over the years of what aggression actually is. And so for one researcher, what might be a statistically significant difference is for another researcher only moderately statistically significant, right? Or mildly. So there's some question about like how do you compare or like build a body of research if the findings are kind of different, and then also how are you defining? Again, going back to like the thought, a feeling, and aggression, or other things as well. And as I mentioned, it is ethically dubious to use actual aggression, and so researchers have tried to come up with different substitutes for what aggression might mean. 2 examples. One is a loud noise blast. And so they will have people play a game, and then maybe you can watch your friend play, and you get to use a loud noise blast to punish them for certain activities, right? And the idea is that the loud noise blast is a stand-in for being aggressive. Kind of questionable whether that is really true or not. But my favorite is the hot sauce, where you again can punish your friend by putting more hot sauce on the food that they're going to eat. And my friends would probably like it if I put more hot sauce on the food. So it's questionable again, like, is this a really good stand-in? And just the point is, we don't really have perfect measures for studying these kinds of things. The 2 large theories that have arisen from all of this research are the general aggression model, the GAM, which is the way it's referred to in the literature, which is Craig Anderson is usually the leading author in these studies, which is focusing on thoughts, is installing scripts for behavior. So you have those violent thoughts, you have them enough and enough and enough, and suddenly you've got like a little checklist in your mind of what you're going to do. And sort of in opposition, Chris Ferguson has done work, and he calls it the catalyst model. He's very critical of the GAM, and he focuses more on things like inborn personality traits that might position people, especially kids, for later problems. And he's also really interested in the environment, so your social background, your social class, those kinds of things. Everyone agrees it's not a simple issue, and that there are multiple factors, as I mentioned before. For example, with the thread, it's just not that video games are going to take a perfectly normal child and turn them into a raving lunatic, but that your neighborhood, your family life, your school performance, your friends, if you have friends, what type of friends, the personality that you have, your social history, your other media diet, your gender, gender is often underexplored, your mental health, all of these things play a role. And I also like to, if people ask me, sort of flip the script. So, instead of saying, what do games do to people, ask what people do with games. And I'm just going to highlight a couple quick examples, and you probably know of more on your own. But for example, kids and adults have been incredibly creative. Nick Watson has done a lot of work studying modding that occurs in Minecraft. This is somebody who turned Minecraft into an RPG. Players have created extensive game guides, reviews, translations of games that don't come out in their native language for others to enjoy. This means that they're getting a deep knowledge of how the games work. They're forming communities and trying to expose others to them. Games are incredibly social. Earlier, this was brought up as well. Most people play games with others, and even if they are playing single-player games, the game forms a topic for conversation and sociality in other spaces. I've done research on players who enjoy games with ethical decision-making, like lots of moral choices. Like, do you nuke the town, or are you the Paragon or the Renegade? Spoiler alert, most people play as the good guy. They do not enjoy being the evil person, and the ones who try have to force themselves to do it. People live stream themselves. There are like over 2 million people live streaming on Twitch right now, and that's just in North America. There are other systems as well where people are doing this, and they're also building communities. People really love to dissect and take apart games like Speedrunners to see how quickly they can get through the game. Again, this demands patience, mastery, perseverance, all qualities we say we laud. And there are many more examples that I won't go into now, but maybe we can talk about in the Q&A. Thanks.
Good. My name's Andy. I am the president of the Higher Education Video Game Alliance, which I'll discuss in a minute. I collect academic titles, apparently. I'm currently at RIT, but I will soon be in Christchurch, New Zealand, at Canterbury, and I've been working at American this past semester, so I get lots of little logos. And I made some stuff at RIT once, like a game center. Okay, so we'll start with a personal story. The Higher Education Video Game Alliance is about to turn 5 years old in 2 weeks from the day that it was founded. It was founded by people that probably lots of you know, so Drew and Tracy and Constance and all of that. And Constance was the first president, and when she decided to step down, she dragged me into her office, and she can be very convincing, as those of you that know her. And she said, so you're going to do this next. So, okay. And she said, but I just want to set the stage for you that like it's going to be okay, right? Like we've had the hard battles. Like games are in a better place now. When Sandy Hook happened, there was a whole big dust up with Joe Biden and what the games and violence issue was hitting the national press and all of that kind of stuff, and that had died down. She said it's going to be okay, and this is like November of like 2 years ago. So of course we had another shooting in this country, because that's what we do in this country. We like to have school shootings, apparently. I don't know why. And right away, our esteemed president opened his mouth about video games, and we went through the whole thing again. What's particularly interesting to me is that his tweet is actually from 2012. which nobody bothered to note in the context of the national discussion right around that. Super, right? So in that sense, everything old is new again, because we're going to have this same debate about games and violence one more time, just like we do every time that one of these tragedies happens. And what's interesting about that is that when you think about national politics, when you think about discourse and debate, of course, people are not at their most rational the minute that we've just experienced one of these events. And so all of that research that Mia just talked about, right, is trying to take a long view and trying to study this in context and what that stuff looks like. But all of that goes out the window, right, the minute there's a bunch of dead children on TV. And everybody has to then, dive on what are we going to do about this right now, right? So what was interesting about that was behind the scenes, there were a bunch of academics that were starting to do op-eds, that were starting to do interviews, that were starting to do all this kind of stuff to say, hey, wait a minute, like this is not the research doesn't actually stand up to your instinctual sort of like games make people violent, right? How does this affect you? Well, for example, in the wake of that shooting, the president commissioned the school safety report from an ad hoc panel that was run out of Department of Education. That group had to issue back policy guidelines, and though that report actually references and singles out the Motion Picture Association of America as a cause or a potential cause for inciting violence in youth. It's a pretty scary statement, right? But movies do it and games don't, and the only reason games don't is because games won that round of how to actually engage with the debate and lobby around it, right? And I thought that was really interesting. How does this affect you? Well, we have the very nice Supreme Court decision about games being protected speech and all of that. If you haven't noticed, the makeup of the court has shifted a little bit. They could re-legislate or re-decide at any time. We're seeing that in other political battles right now. So I don't take for granted the fact that they're protected speech. That could go away, right? You could have a comics code for games pretty quickly. And there's probably some history there around authoritarianism and media manipulation things. So I thought that was pretty interesting. That was a great wake-up call for my first little bit as president of AdCon. Made for some interesting times. And then the WHO thing happened. The World Health Organization thing happened. And that's the panel that we had in this room last year. Because I watched some of my colleagues that did this very impassioned plea around we need to have real research. We need to take the long view. We need to try to understand this relationship, if there is one, between games and violence. We don't need to jump to conclusions. And then turn around at the very same moment and say, well, I mean, we don't really know that about addiction either. The research is kind of all over the place and kind of in the same, like everyone is arguing with everybody. The American Psychological Association issued a statement in opposition of the World Health Organization. Like it's kind of just crazy. But they would say, yeah, but I mean, games are addicting. Because like I see these people playing Fortnite. And these are my colleagues, right? And I'm like, you did not just say that, right? Like, you can't argue that critical research is important in one arena and then turn around and not hold that same view, right? Like that, it just doesn't work. So a better way of saying that, right, is when Chris Ferguson gave the keynote at Chi Play. It's time for a reassessment of games research and how social culture of moral panic impacted games research over the past few decades. We need to start, we as academics need to engage in this public debate around this media, right? Not to say that this media does this or doesn't do that, right? But simply to point out the role of science, to point out the role of research, to point out the role of critical discourse around what that looks like, right? Because otherwise, you're going to let the politicians do it, and you're going to get a very different response. I'm sometimes called an apologist for the games industry. I think that's interesting, because I'm pretty sure that Activision doesn't need me to apologize for them. And I want to point out that you can be critical of games or critical of practices from the games industry, but that doesn't necessitate being in agreement with some of the policy decisions that we're trying to debate around here. This is Andrew Frisbie. I'm horrible at saying his name. Really smart guy. He's at the Oxford or Oxford Internet Institute. He's actually doing some of the work to try to examine this classification from the WHO and what it actually means and where it could. He's super critical of the fact that we pathologized this so early. Also super critical of the way ESA handled it from a lobbying perspective, right? You can be critical of both of those things at the same time, and I'm going to come back to that. People want to cast this as a left-right debate. This is what's more concerning to me. If you can't see the little graph there, essentially the voting age of the American constituencies is old and gets older. Right? So when we think about who is voting and who is voting who into office and the average age of the American lawmaker, right, there is a generational divide around games, around the kinds of games we play, around the different forms of media that we engage with. And so when we have those debates, we have to remember that in this room, we can have a very nuanced discussion around what games are and how they're made and who they're for and different types of media and the stories they tell and all that kind of stuff. I go out and I speak at a lot of junior high schools to people that want to be game developers. And I talk to their parents and all this kind of stuff. This is the public understanding as I can best describe it for games. There's an idea person, something magic pixie stuff, and then there's a game. Right? And so that is a scary thing when you start to think about law and policy trying to interject themselves relative to what they know around the way that games are made and who they're made for and what that discourse is. Right? We've talked about some big national examples. Right? Here's one that's bubbling up now, and this is again, right? There is now a bipartisan congressional bill. Bipartisan, right? They don't agree on anything, but they agree that loot boxes are bad. Right? And you can agree that in fact loot boxes are bad. They're crap design, right? They're yuck, right? But at the same time, that bill is also bad. Why? Because that bill would effectively ban any in-game financial transaction, period. So that means if you want to give your game away for free and then try to charge somebody for stuff in the game, can't do it anymore. Gone, right? So paying attention to what's happening there, right? And now who's that going to hurt? That's going to hurt indies, not the big guys, right? So when we think about it engaging in that context, what I would say is there's lots of resources out there. I would encourage all of you, right, to think about your role and your voice in that debate. Because as scholars, as creators, as people connected to games, right, you're the person with knowledge. Right? I got told by my university at one point, maybe you could just not say anything because we really shouldn't argue with the medical community because they're the medical community. They know how people work, not you. And I was like, yes, that's probably fair to say. I'm not a doctor. I'm also pretty sure they don't know anything about video games based on some of the things that they're saying. So maybe we should have experts on games connected to that debate. And I think very much to Mia's point, let's remember some of the awesome things that games have done along the way. So in conclusion, beware the media rumor. Remember that we've been here before. Beware the unpublished or preliminary research or sponsored study, because there's a bunch of them out there. Seek empathy with the motivations of parents. Right? That's who's engaging with this at a policy discourse level. Right? Remember that you are an expert in the creation of games. Most people have no idea how games are planned, made, marketed, or sold. And the relationship that we have with just about any form of media is complex, and a lot of times the research is less clear than we want it to be. And you make the difference when you speak as a games creator, researcher, or professional. With that, got a little bit of time for Q&A. There's our panelists. All of the hard questions we will put in an email and send to Roger, because he is not here. And it has to go all the way to Australia, so you may or may not get an answer to them. But with that, we'll try to take any of your slightly easier questions.
Thank you. So there are wireless mics floating around, and we're going to stand here awkwardly waiting for your questions.
Wait, someone didn't want to wait.
Hi, Daniel Greenberg with the IGDA Anti-Censorship Committee. I wonder if you're aware of another thing going on with the World Health Organization, which is that Congress has caught them being corrupted by Purdue to push opioids on the world. There's a report in Congress now about that. And seeing that, I couldn't help but think there might be something linked about these. And having thrown this new piece of information to you, I wonder if you'd care to wildly speculate about it, since I don't know if you've heard it before, but it's true.
I just saw little pieces of that start floating across my news stream. I know when Chris was presenting at Kai Play, he had some screenshots of some emails that there were some political motivations behind some of the decision to enact the classification within who. I think in part it's a human organization, and so the degree to which human organizations are suspect, I think there's probably a lot that you could dig into something like that, right? At the same time, I understand the fear, right? I get that sort of moral panic, right? You can logically work out, oh, this is a thing that our kids do that their parents may not do in the same way to the same extent, right? We always tend to have divides around that where a generation is looking at the behavior of the next generation and going, we need to get this into check and so on. There are some cases to be made, I think, with WHO in particular, that they have moved into, and Chris just did a big piece on this, talking not just about the game stuff, but the overclassification of a bunch of different things and what it means for psychology as a field, and whether or not that is, how that is shaping the discourse in that field right now, which I would definitely advise anybody to check it out. So that's kind of a non-answer in the sense that I don't know yet, but I'm certainly gonna read up on it.
There's a question back there.
Hi, Pablo Figueroa, Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. I do VR, virtual reality is something that I love, and when I see games in VR, I love to see more games, but I don't want to see first-person shooters in VR or these type of games. And it's getting harder and harder to convince people that games in VR could be nice, because you can see that kids are more involved and they are more immersed. So what kind of thoughts you have on violent games in VR?
I'll take that, I guess. So I have a couple of thoughts. I actually encourage you to take a look. You can just go to my website. Research is a dialogue back and forth. So there was a researcher, this is last year, who claimed that VR was going to make people even more violent because it was a training ground. It was so, this is the argument you've seen year after year, which is that hyper-realism, the closer we get to reality, the more people are going to be capable of transferring that over into the real world. And I lampooned what I thought was, and I will say this very publicly, was the worst recommendation for combating that, or a very bad understanding of how game design works. The researcher suggested that we start curving bullets in video games so that people are no longer as good shooting real guns. That recommendation is astoundingly, do you understand how any of this works, right? It's why don't we stop them from getting guns? I don't know if the curving is going to do anything. So there is a lot of misunderstanding. I think, so a lot of what I teach, a lot of what's in my book, a lot of what I've been teaching for the last 15 years in game design is about this sort of universal language of play, the fact that animals play, that humans play. So our inclination, our interest in play, I don't think, as an example, Noah Falstein has made claims before about the idea that some of what we're attracted to is about practicing things that keep us alive. So collecting, like collecting food, killing to prevent being killed, or things that are attractive. It kind of calls it natural fun activity. I think that's one dimension, but I think it's our responsibility as designers to actually just design more interesting and engaging experiences. We are imitating what we've seen in non-VR spaces instead of taking the opportunity the medium presents. And if you want examples of things that people are continually compelled by, grab Tetris, right? Like people that was a distinctly different experience based on an analog play that really drove like a whole sort of genre of play. So yeah, I don't think we need to keep making first-person shooters to make really engrossing VR experiences.
Yeah, and I mean, very much to your point, like I've also gotten that argument, right, of like, if it becomes too real, right, then people won't be able to distinguish, the VR environment from the real one and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, we actually do have WHO classifications for people that can't distinguish between games and reality, right? and we don't need a gaming disorder in order to know what to do there, right? And so, that's one piece of it, right? I think a second piece of it is there's a lot of good work happening around VR and the integration of VR with not just games, but with film and storytelling and all this kind of stuff. The thing that I'm going to go do in Christchurch, New Zealand is all about using, they term it immersive games, but essentially it's VR, AR, with a desire for social impact and positive play. And you're seeing that pop up at lots of different places, right? So, I think there will be, for a time, this sort of focus on translating big first-person shooters into VR, because that's what the big industry publishers know how to make and know how to market, right? And big ships don't turn that quick, right? Little ships tend to get out in front of them and slice and do all kinds of crazy things. So I think the innovation space is going to be in the slightly smaller stuff for a while.
Hey, I'm Kelly Whitney. I'm with iCivics. I have a sort of different direction, which is how do we talk about benefits of gaming in a way that's, with the Institute of Play closing down, with research is waning on the educational benefits of games, and we're out there, producing, making games, trying to fight the good fight. But it feels like the research community has gotten a little, just feels like it's slowed down a lot in the last 5 to 10 years. The amount of research about games for learning and and that kind of thing. And I'm just curious if you have thoughts about that, what we can do to reinvigorate it. We don't want this movement to go away. It really makes a huge difference. We see huge gains in the kids that use our work. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Mm-hmm. I can start, which is also something I forgot to mention is, the research on games and violence is some of the most heavily scrutinized research out there. I would not want to be doing this research because everybody just leaps on you when it comes out. And honestly, I don't think we've been as critical about outcomes, about games for good, games for change that replicate what we want to find, right? And I think we do need more critical attention, more studies of those types of games and situations. I think lots of projects either run out of funding, don't have time for the follow-up study, don't look at things, a year or two down the road. And, I think as researchers, we need to do a better job of organizing that work to say, we've looked just as carefully at these games as we have, the violent shooter games. And so that we have, we can say with confidence, what's really going on. And I haven't seen, I guess, as much of that. Lindsay?
All I was going to say is that I think one of the ways it may feel like that's happening less is because I think it's actually done a much better job of integrating it. So when we talked 5 to 10 years ago, especially 10 years ago, there was so much defense of games as separate. And in my experience in running our studio out of DC, I found that I had a lot of opportunity as games as integral, as part of a larger media strategy. So I think what happens is we may not be seeing as much of that research because it's part of, it's integrated as instead of being vestigial, which is an argument I've been making for years. I think it's much smarter for us to be a part of a lot of things than for the games community to perpetually juxtapose itself to other things. So for example, it becomes labeled as VR research, although it's highly ludic, or it becomes labeled as what I've often done, which is engagement design, but it's borrowing from a lot of the things that we learned 10 years ago in games.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I would say, and it sounds very glib, but I don't mean it to be, vote. One of the reasons
Funding.
that you're feeling a little bit of that, right, is MacArthur has kind of pulled back from funding in that space, Carnegie's kind of pulled back from funding in that space. But they're all taking their cues off the fact that we have a Department of Education right now that's just gone haywire. So, you know, there's not thought leadership in that space right now, right? And that's one of the things that I think is that's one of the reasons you're feeling that, right? And so, you know, I don't think anybody looks at public education, at least in the United States, and goes, well, we solved it, right? But right, that's not the priority in the discourse right now. And so, how does it regain centrality in terms of the discourse? You know, that is a broader question that we're coming up on an election year. So how to make that a part of that discourse, I think, is critical. Not just relative to the games issue, but the positioning of education as a public good, period.
We're out of time.
We're out of time.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.